Good morning. Space situational awareness is a very large topic. There are a lot of different slices of it. There's an important terrestrial component. There are objects on Earth that look at space. There are cataloging components, how we compile the data that we've collected. There's data distribution components, national security components. So what I'm going to do today is talk about one slice. So you shouldn't take this as the whole world. This is just a piece of a very large and evolving puzzle. The slice that I'm going to look at today is the relationship between the private sector, which is operating in excess of 300 or 400 objects in space at the moment. I'm going to look how the private sector relates to governments, specifically the U.S. government, the governments in general, and the issue of data sharing. So a couple of years ago, I think it was late fall of 2010, the industry got together to create an organization called the Space Data Association. And the reasons we created that and where that organization is and some of our observations on the state of space situational awareness are the bulk of this presentation. First slide. The executive members, and basically the founders of this organization, were the large satellite companies, SES, Intelsat, Inmarsat, recently joined by Eutelsat. We have a number of other members which are listed there. So I think in terms of the Space Data Association now has all major satellite operators involved, and those members got together and created a group called the Space Data Center. That center is charged with responsibility of the data sharing. And the chief technology advisor for that process is AGI. They're sort of the engine that makes this whole process work. Next slide. So why did we do this? I think it's for a lot of complicated reasons. The simplest ones are we're all flying more complicated fleets these days. So we own about 55 satellites in geostationary orbit. We fly about 77 because we fly satellites for other people. So the process of flying satellites has gotten more complicated. The fleets are larger. There's more operators in space. There's a lot more radio frequency interference. So you've got physical concerns about objects being operated in close proximity to each other. You've also got electronic concern. As you've increased the density of objects in space, you've also greatly increased the amount of interference that is in space. There is no cookbook for flying satellite fleets. There's no school that you go to get certified. All the major operators, Intelsat, Eutelsat, SES, all these people basically have been in this business for a long time. They each have different ways of doing things. They each have different ways of talking about what they do, so the formats are all different. So basically you have a bunch of different companies who all speak different languages, who need to work together. So to confront this Tower of Babel, we decided to create the Space Data Association. So a couple of bottom lines. We are, what I'm going to talk a little about is where we are. The most significant bottom line that I hope to get some time to come back to is we did some independent testing. Right now, the primary way that people get warnings about the conjunction of objects in space is through the Joint Space Operations Center. We did some validation last September, on operator-to-operator data, and we believe that that there are significant differences in the data that the Joint Space Operations Center has from the data that the operators are using. And that means that we don't actually know where we are. And we can come back to why that's important in a minute. Okay, next slide. Obviously, the primary purpose behind Space Data Association is safety of flight. It also is a great place for us to speak in a common language. So the Space Data Center takes all the individual operator data and it converts it into a common language so that the data can be shared. It also, as I'll explain in a minute, it also greatly enhances our ability to resolve interference events, and it encourages, I think importantly, encourages the evolution of best practices by operators. So that it's a format where operators can get together and where everyone on the same playing field and decide what is in their best interest in terms of rules of operating procedure. Next slide. So in just a quick snapshot of where we are, the initial operating capability was put in place in July of 2010. We went fully operational with the system in September of 2011. We're currently performing collision avoidance monitoring for about, I think it's 237 satellites from 15 operators and 110 satellites from 7 LEO operators. So we're tracking about 347 satellites right now. Next slide. So to the rub. Again, as I said, the primary way that operators get alerts these days is the Joint Space Operations Center puts out what's called conjunction summary messages, or referred to as CSMs. So obviously the question is, when you get a warning, the question is how accurate is it? So we ran our own tests last year, and we discovered that the majority of conjunctions or close approaches were missed by the Joint Space Operations Center. And the majority of conjunction summary messages that went out advising us of close approaches were wrong. So the bottom line is that the current products which are in use are not adequate for the safety of flight. And indeed, more recently, we've been cautioned by the JSPOC that the CSM warnings are not actionable and that they're actually more or less advisory and encouraging us to do more research. So again, this is not meant as a criticism of the Joint Space Operations Center. This is merely data. Okay, so we have good data that says we're operating in a way that's not yet as safe as we possibly could be. There is no other system out there. There's no other government attempting to do what the Joint Space Operations Center is doing. So kudos to the United States government for the incredible work they've done so far. Our data is indicating there's a lot of work that needs to be done yet. Next slide. Just to point out, this isn't just about things smashing together in space. This is also about the number one problem for commercial operators is not objects running into each other. We do a pretty good job of managing our fleets. The biggest issue for most operators is interference. And knowing precisely where objects are greatly accelerates the ability to resolve these issues. Next slide. So you get a sense of how do you resolve an interference event without and with the Space Data Center. You know, without it, you've got to actually physically call. You have to call the other guy. And then you're hoping that you get the right person on the phone, and it's not the middle of the night, and it's the wrong person, and you don't know what data format they're working in. And so there's an awful lot of talking that has to go on. And so one of the goals that we've had is to try to make this process as clean as possible. And what we have discovered is that with the data system that we put together, that you get 2 orders of magnitude increase in fidelity on interference. So what does that actually mean? Let's look at the charts. So how does geolocation work today? It's really not magic. It's just the same kind of triangulation that GPS uses. The variance. It assumes that 2 satellites are receiving the interfering signal. And if you have 2 satellites that are receiving the interfering signal, and you know how those satellites are, how the payloads are working, where they are, exactly where they are, you can do the math to figure out where the interferer is. So if you use the data that's available, so-called two-line element data, or TLE data, so the data that's publicly available, and you merge TLE versus TLE on the 2 satellites, what you'll get is a huge ellipse on the ground. And you can get some sense, that's the Earth you're looking at, so you get some sense of the size of the ellipse. So what that's saying is that somewhere in that ellipse, there's an interferer. If you take, sorry, next, Bill. Right, okay, so that's the ellipse on the Earth. Then the next one shows what you would get if you use SDA data, operator data, versus the TLE. So you can see the ellipse has gotten very much smaller. So you're looking in a very much smaller area for the interfering data. And then last one. So I know this is small, but if you look at the last one, you can see that dot is now where you've identified the interfering signal is. So you went from looking at a big hunk of Earth to a very small hunk of Earth. This is relevant for a whole bunch of purposes, certainly relevant for the commercial sector in terms of resolving interference events, which are preventing service. It's also highly important for governments because, as we've seen in the case of Iran and British Broadcasting and Voice of America, that where you've got active jamming, it's also important where countries are using interference as a tool, as either a weapon or a diplomatic tool. So it's very important that we have the ability to do this. Today, this ability does not really exist, except in very limited cases. And then finally, conclusion. So look, we've got to get better. The space environment, as everyone knows, is getting more complicated. We've got to get better at working through stressed conditions, stressed environment. We've got to get away from the idea that we're doing exchanges between human beings, or that we're doing special requests for information. We've got to get to the point where we have machine-to-machine interference, machine-to-machine interchange on key technical data. That doesn't exist today. We have offered our data to the U.S. government, to other governments. So far, there is no government that can take that data and use it, and no government is today making use of the data that is available because their systems are not structured to do that. So we have identified a big gap, and this effort is not funded by any government. This is a company-funded initiative. Not one dime of taxpayer money from any government went into putting this together. So the private sector has stepped up. We've taken 2 large steps in front of the governments. It's time for the governments to respond in kind and figure out how to make this a safer environment for all of us to work in. Thank you.